Hello historians and welcome back. Today we will be looking at the early life of Queen Mary I. Mary had her title of princess stripped away from her in 1533 upon the birth of her half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, and Mary was made illegitimate. Both her father, King Henry VIII, and her stepmother Anne Boleyn insisted that Mary referred to herself as the Lady Mary, the king's daughter, much to Mary's displeasure. It's September 1533. Mary's half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, was born on the 7th and christened on the 10th. By the December, Mary was forced, pretty much against her will, to join her younger sister's household at Hatfield. Mary's household was disbanded. She was stripped of the title of princess and was now to act as maid of honour for her half-sister as the Lady Mary. The Lady Mary had a close relationship with her governess Margaret, Countess of Salisbury. The Lady Salisbury got dismissed despite offering her services and was replaced by two of Anne Boleyn's relatives, Lady Anne Shelton and Lady Anne Clear, who had been sent by Anne to spy on her stepdaughter and make her life miserable. Anne hated the Lady Mary as she saw her for competition for her own daughter, the Princess Elizabeth. It was noted that in the February of 1534, Anne Boleyn had written to the Lady Shelton to ensure that Mary no longer used the title of princess, telling Shelton to slap her face as the cursed bastard that she was, if she persisted. The Lady Shelton was scared in case Mary fell ill, and she got the blame. And despite Anne's wishes, Anne Shelton befriended the Lady Mary. 1535 was a scary year for the Lady Mary, as Anne, who had had a miscarriage since the birth of Elizabeth, was pressing her husband, King Henry VIII, to execute his ex-wife and daughter. Anne told Henry that she had a dream that it would be impossible to conceive a child while Catherine and Mary lived. The reality was that Anne was actually safe all the time that Catherine was alive, because he wasn't going to get rid of her, seeing all the trouble that was caused to marry her in the first place. Plus, that would prove that he was wrong, and the king is not wrong. Henry was also starting to get frustrated with his strong-headed wife. Pun not intended. He failed to rise to Anne's bait, but that didn't stop her from pressing for their execution, which she did again in the November, as Anne was pregnant again. Anne was scared for herself, Elizabeth, and her unborn child. But Henry would not succumb to Anne's demands. During 1535, Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, was terribly ill, and her father and her stepmother had forbidden her from seeing her mother. On the 1st of December, it looked like Catherine might recover, so Anne Boleyn pushed Henry again to execute both Mary and Catherine. However, Henry had received Catherine's medical records and knew that Catherine did not have long, so he didn't act. And he was right. Mary's mother died 6 days later on the 7th of January 1536, at the age of 50, at Kimbolton Castle. In her will, Catherine left Mary the collar of gold which I brought out of Spain, and her furs. But Henry never passed on Catherine's belongings to his daughter. Anne, who was happy with the passing of her rival, offered an olive branch to her stepdaughter, inviting Mary back to court, stating she didn't have to carry Anne's train, and she would always walk by her side, on the condition that she submitted to her father's laws and recognised their marriage. Mary refused, and to add insult to injury, in the April, Mary stated that she believed the musician Mark Smeaton was Elizabeth's real father.
Uptight mama's daughter say what?
I feel like this is interesting because Mark Smeaton was actually one of the men that got executed with Anne's brother George Boleyn, because he was one of the men that was believed she had committed adultery with. So even before her downfall, there's this whole little thing going on between Anne and Mark Smeaton. Mary's stepmother was arrested on the 6th of May 1536, and Anne was accused at her trial of having poisoned the Dowager Queen Catherine and attempting to poison the Lady Mary. The night before her execution, Anne Boleyn thought that her fate was God's judgment for treating the Lady Mary so badly. Anne was beheaded the next day at the Tower of London. The death of Anne meant that Henry was now able to remarry, as both of his disputed wives were dead.
Wait a tick. That means I'm single again! Oh, behave!
The news of Anne Boleyn's death revived Mary's spirits, as she now hoped that she may be able to reconcile with her father, with the help of her new stepmother-to-be, Jane Seymour. Although, to be fair, Mary, Anne did offer to help, although equally, she did try and have you executed.
Not a great plan.
So swings and roundabouts, I guess. Henry married his third wife and Mary's second stepmother on the 30th of May 1536, 11 days after Anne's execution. The Lady Mary offered her submission to her father on the 13th of June, and with the help of Jane Seymour, father and daughter were reconciled. But as Mary and Henry's relationship mended, Henry and Elizabeth's fractured, and Elizabeth was stripped of her title of princess and became a lady like her sister Mary. Henry was glad that his daughter had finally seen the light, but was irritated that it had taken her that long. He sent Sir Thomas Wriothesley to obtain a full declaration of Mary's faults in writing, and to ask her what ladies she would like in her household when she returns to her place in society. Mary was so grateful that she wrote a long letter to Thomas Cromwell, acknowledging her faults and thanking him for his kindness. Also, don't forget that Cromwell helped with the downfall of Anne Boleyn. When Henry read it, he was so happy he became the loving father he once was. Queen Jane was delighted, as she had been working on smoothing tensions for months. Also, it was rather lonely for Jane. Very few of her ladies could associate on virtually equal terms. Jane was from a minor gentry family and had steadily climbed the social ladder, and she had separated herself from those she had been friendly with to emphasise her rank. But now she was rather isolated. As the king's daughter, Mary was of high enough rank that she could provide companionship for the Queen. On the 6th of July, Henry and Jane visited Mary at her house in Hackney. It was the first time that Henry had spoken of his daughter affectionately in 6 years. He was kind and gentle with her, and 2 days later it was announced that Mary would rank as second lady at court after Queen Jane. Jane had not concerned herself with Anne Boleyn's child, Elizabeth. Mary had always been fond of her little sister, despite who her mother was, and she had started to take an interest in her sister's well-being and visited her at Hatfield on the 21st of July. Mary wrote to their father saying that Elizabeth was in good health and in time he would have a good cause to be proud of his youngest daughter. Mary had hopes this may help mend Henry and Elizabeth's relationship, like Jane had helped fix her own. That Christmas, Henry thought Jane was pregnant. Mary fainted when she witnessed her father patting Jane's belly, and both Henry and Jane had to assist getting Mary off the floor. Thanks to Mary's intervention in the relationship between Elizabeth and Henry, Elizabeth was also at court over Christmas, and was the first time that the family had been together. Henry and Jane sat at the table together, and Mary sat opposite Jane. Elizabeth wasn't old enough to join the adults, but Henry was seen playing with his youngest daughter during the festivities. Jane Seymour gave birth to her son Edward on the 12th of October 1537. Both Mary and Elizabeth had a role to play at their half-brother's christening. Mary was assigned as one of his godparents, and Elizabeth carried by Lord Beauchamp, Edward Seymour, and in her hands was the chrism. When the baptism was finished and Edward was named heir, Edward was conveyed back to the Queen's apartments, followed by his two sisters. This time, Elizabeth was walking holding hands with Mary. Jane Seymour would die from childbirth complications on the 24th of October 1537. After the Queen's death, Mary returned to Hunsdon with her sister Elizabeth, where she looked after her. Easter 1538, Mary brings the 4.5-year-old Elizabeth to court, and under Mary's tutelage, she was rigidly schooled in good behaviour and taught at an early age to wield a needle. Elizabeth became such an expert needlewoman that she completed a shirt of Cambridge and gave it as a New Year's Eve present for her brother Edward in 1539, but she was now accepted by her father once again. During her father's widowhood, Henry VIII tried and failed many times to arrange a marriage with Christina, Duchess of Milan. Milan would have made a nice addition to Henry's kingdom. As Christina said no, Henry tried to arrange marriages to Italian nobles for Elizabeth and Mary Fitzroy, Henry's former daughter-in-law. Henry also offered the Lady Mary as a bride to Dom Louis of Portugal, but nothing came out of any of these matches. December 1539, Henry VIII proposed a marriage between the Lady Mary and Duke Philip of Bavaria, who, much to Mary's dislike, was a Protestant. Henry, however, continued to press with the match, despite his daughter's disapproval, and invited Philip to London. According to historian Alison Weir, Mary declared that she would rather remain unmarried than enter such an alliance. But when Philip arrived in London, Mary had to greet him out of etiquette. From what I can gather, the two got on very well, despite the religious differences, and Philip told Henry that he wished to continue with the marriage. Mary then fell ill again. Whether this was real or fake, I don't know, but she basically hid from court so she didn't have to see Philip. And she was away for so long that she missed her father's wedding on the 6th of January 1540. On the 6th of January 1540, Henry VIII married his fourth wife, the Protestant Princess Anne of Cleves. The Lady Mary, a staunch Catholic, was horrified to learn that her father had married a Lutheran heretic. And yet, ironically, Mary and her new stepmother Anne of Cleves would become good friends, and Mary would convert the Lutheran heretic to Catholicism. Philip, Duke of Bavaria, hung around in England for most of January, just hoping that Mary would have recovered from her illness. However, now that Henry was married to Anne of Cleves and he decided he didn't like his new wife, Henry was now no longer interested in an alliance with a German. Philip, Duke of Bavaria, left England on the 27th of January, and the Lady Mary had miraculously recovered from her illness.
Right.
Henry was not a fan of his fourth wife and was desperate for an annulment so he could get married to his wife's lady-in-waiting, who he had had his eye on. Henry didn't have to wait long, and the couple divorced on the 12th of July 1540.
Will it tick? That means I'm single again!
Henry then married for a fifth time on the 28th of July 1540 to Catherine Howard, a woman who was younger than his eldest daughter, the Lady Mary. Mary was not the greatest fan of her new stepmother, but Queen Catherine was keen to make a good impression, and so, on the 3rd of January 1541, she invited her husband's ex-wife Anne of Cleves and the Lady Mary to Hampton Court Palace. Relations between Mary and Catherine were still not great, but Anne of Cleves got on with everyone, so she was able to smooth things over. Henry then had Mary's former governess and godmother, Margaret Parr, Countess of Salisbury, executed on the 27th of May 1541 because he had issue with Margaret's son, Reginald, and she was executed on the pretext that she was involved with a Catholic plot, which is highly unlikely, but still possible. Her execution was an absolute mess. Like, whoever organised this execution should be ashamed of themselves. Her executioner was inexperienced, and her neck and shoulders were hacked several times before the head came off. I can only imagine the anger and frustration that Mary would have felt towards her father at this point for executing someone who was so dear to her heart. And also, what made this worse is the fact that Margaret Parr was a pensioner.
What?
The Lady Mary then found herself involved in a marriage proposal between herself and the Duke of Orleans. But the ever-shaky relations of England and France deteriorated, and nothing happened. Catherine Howard, Mary's fourth stepmother, was executed for adultery on the 13th of February 1542.
Will it tick?
That Christmas, Henry invited Mary to attend the royal Christmas festivities. It was the custom for the Queen Consort to be the hostess. However, as Henry was
single again,
and thus without a consort, Mary acted as hostess. Henry married for the sixth and final time on the 12th of July 1543 to Catherine Parr. Catherine, who had experience at being a stepmother, was alarmed to learn that all of her stepchildren lived away from court and rarely saw their father, and she was determined to provide a stable family environment for her stepchildren, and was the first stepmother to provide motherly affection since Jane Seymour. However, Mary was 27 and arguably didn't need a mother figure as much as her siblings Elizabeth IX and Edward V might have. By the August, Mary was a frequent visitor at court and was enjoying being in the company of her parents. Mary and Catherine Parr would soon become friends and respected Mary as the princess that she is, despite her father thinking otherwise. Catherine, who was 31, was of a similar age to her stepdaughter, but old enough so the dynamic didn't feel too weird, like it did with Catherine Howard. And the two shared similar interests. With the help of Catherine Parr, the ladies Mary and Elizabeth were put back in the line of succession when the new Act of Succession was passed on the 7th of February 1544. It stated that any children Henry and Catherine had, or children with another queen, would go after Edward, and if there was no other issue, then it would go to the Lady Mary, and then the Lady Elizabeth. On the 17th of February 1544, the Duke of Najera, a duke, visited the English court. Mary shined very brightly during this visit, as she could speak Spanish, so she could help Queen Catherine converse with the Duke. Later in the September, Mary received a letter from Catherine, who, don't forget, was a published author, praising her for her translation of Erasmus's paraphrases, and said Mary should publish her work. Mary declined the offer, and Catherine responded that she did not see why you should reject the praise which all deservedly would give you. Yet I leave all to your own prudence, and will approve of what seems best to you. Mary then said that she would contemplate publishing her work, if she could do it under a pseudonym. Catherine, as an early feminist, told Mary that it would do a real injury if you refused to let it go down to posterity under auspices of your own name. Mary finally caved, and the translation was printed and widely read, and received high praise from scholars across Europe. On the 27th of January 1547, King Henry VIII knew his time was nearly over. He saw his confessor and received Holy Communion. He then saw his daughter Mary and made her promise to be a king and a loving mother to Edward, whom he would leave as a little helpless child. Mary, who was in floods of tears, begged her father not to leave her an orphan so soon. Henry dismissed his crying child from the room. Mary's father, King Henry VIII, died on the 28th of January 1547 at Whitehall Palace. Upon her father's death, Mary inherited several estates in Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, and was given Hunsdon and Beaulieu. Her younger brother Edward became King Edward VI. Typically, a queen consort would be expected to mourn for a few years. However, Dowager Queen Catherine Parr got remarried within a few months to Thomas Seymour. The Lady Mary was, like many, thought this was scandalous, and she lost some of her respect for her stepmother. Thomas Seymour wrote Mary a letter asking her to use her influence to help gain favour with the council for approval of the marriage, and to help persuade Catherine to go public with the marriage. Mary was horrified at his impertinence and responded saying, "It standeth least with my poor honour to be a meddler in this matter, concerning whose wife her grace was of late. If she remembrance of the king's majesty will not suffer her to grant your suit, I am nothing able to persuade her to forget the loss of him who is yet very ripe in mine own remembrance." But Mary's response didn't matter, because by the time Thomas received it, Catherine had already come round to the idea of announcing the marriage publicly. Catherine, however, did grieve for the loss of Mary's friendship. Mary then thought of her little sister Elizabeth, and voiced her concern of Elizabeth associating herself with their stepmother, and wanted to protect her innocence. Mary wrote to Elizabeth, warning her of Catherine's wickedness, and begged her to think of her own reputation. But Elizabeth was fond of Catherine, and she wrote a response to Mary, acknowledging their shared grief, and in seeing the scarcely cold body of the king our father, so shamefully dishonoured by the queen our stepmother. Elizabeth then backtracked, saying, "We should make the best of what we cannot remedy. Despite Mary's warning, Elizabeth would join the household of Catherine and Thomas Seymour. And Mary's warning turned out to be right, as Thomas Seymour would behave horrendously towards his ward and would potentially destroy Elizabeth's innocence. Catherine would eventually conceive Thomas's baby, and in the August of 1548, the baby was nearly due. It was at this time that Catherine Parr reconciled with the Lady Mary, as Mary was excited about the birth of the baby, and the two women started corresponding again. Catherine gave birth to a daughter on the 30th of August 1548 at Sudeley Castle. The girl was named Mary after Catherine's stepdaughter, the Lady Mary. The labour was difficult, and Catherine Parr died days later on the 7th of September. Both Mary and Elizabeth grieved for their stepmother. Mary often spoke of the great love and affection that did bear onto her grace, and she never forgot what her father owed to Catherine. Without Catherine there to mediate the relationships of her children, the once close bond between sisters would continue to fracture after Catherine's death. During Edward's reign, the country was going through a second Protestant Reformation, which was tough for the Catholic Mary, who was continuing her Catholic practices anyway. In her eyes, Edward was her little brother, and she was his legal heir, so what was he going to do about it? As Edward couldn't do anything to his sister, he imprisoned her priests instead. In the spring of 1550, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V sent ambassadors to ask Edward for a special license to allow Mary to practice Mass. But Edward said no. Mary asked for Charles's help again, and this time he sent ships to get her from Essex. But Mary was unable to escape, because A, she hesitated, and B, English ships cut off her route. Edward and Mary reunited at Christmas, but their feuding had not ceased. Mary went out of her way to not hide her Catholic practices. She was having Mass 4 times a day. It is said that Edward embarrassed Mary and reduced both her and himself to tears in front of the court, by publicly reproving her for ignoring his laws regarding worship. Mary repeatedly refused Edward's demands that she abandon Catholicism, and Edward persistently refused to drop his demands. The two would make up before the holiday was over, but a month later Edward sent Mary a letter. "You're breaking the law. Correct your behaviour. I have natural affection for you. Do not seek to diminish it." Early July 1553, King Edward VI was extremely ill, and the manipulative Duke of Northumberland changed the Act of Succession, so Mary was bumped off as the heir presumptive. In the new Act of Succession, Mary's cousin, Lady Jane Grey, was next in line, who, conveniently, was married to Northumberland's son Guildford Dudley. The Duke of Northumberland knew that Mary would be a problem for Jane to assume the throne efficiently. So, he summoned Mary to court on the pretense of seeing her dying brother, but Mary is tipped off about Northumberland's trap and flees to her estates in Norfolk. King Edward VI dies on the 6th of July 1553, and Mary's cousin assumes the throne instead of her. On the 10th of July 1553, Mary sends a letter to Jane's Privy Council. She gives them the ultimatum of abandon Jane or start a civil war. Submitting to Mary would also mean loss of titles for most of the members of the Privy Council. The Privy Council then sent a response and got Jane to sign the letter as Jane the Queen, a letter that would later be used as evidence of Jane's treason.
Not a great plan.
However, Mary was her father's daughter. The Lady Mary was more popular than Jane and was a lawful claimant to the throne. After sending a letter to Mary that would ultimately anger her with Jane's signature, the council realised that Mary might have a bigger army than they thought. They also allowed their best politician and military man, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, to leave London and raise a small army to capture Mary at Framlingham Castle. Northumberland underestimated Mary's support. Ultimately, Jane was stripped of her title as Queen and gave up the crown readily for her cousin Mary. Jane had never wanted to be Queen in the first place. Jane was arrested and placed in the Tower of London. Mary was declared Queen of England on the 19th of July 1553. The council, who were in support of Jane, quickly swung to Mary, and Londoners rejoiced at hearing that Mary was their new queen. Mary issued a proclamation that she would not compel any of her subjects to follow Catholicism. By the end of September 1553, she had gone back on this. Mary's sister Elizabeth reached London on the 29th of July 1553, and upon seeing that Mary had not yet arrived, she rode out to meet her sister, who she met on the 31st, at the city gates accompanied by a full royal train. Elizabeth knelt at her sister's feet, swearing her allegiance. Mary smiled and raised her sister from her knees, and the two embraced. As the procession continued on its way towards London, the Lady Elizabeth was in the place of honour, immediately behind her sister. Elizabeth knew that she was more popular than her sister, and so she had to make sure not to overshine her. Queen Mary I entered the Tower of London on the 3rd of August, and upon her arrival, she released all of the Catholics that had been imprisoned by her father. Many called for the death of Jane and Guildford, but Mary didn't want any bloodshed. Francis pleaded that the Grey family had been Northumberland's victims. He was charged with high treason. Henry Grey was set free, and in the September, Mary declared that her sister was still illegitimate, and that she wanted to restore the old ways of worship, which included Bibles only in Latin and no married priests. However, times had changed, and Mary would find it difficult to get her subjects to conform. Mary thought that by forcing people to practice Catholicism, that she was helping them, and she truly did believe that all non-Catholics were going to hell. Mary started with her court, and everyone at her court was supposed to go to maths. Did I say maths or maths? I'm going to leave that in, and I think you can decide in the comment section below if I said maths or maths. Mary started with her court, and everyone at her court was supposed to go to mass, including the Protestant Lady Elizabeth. Mary was crowned Queen Mary I on the 1st of October 1553 at Westminster Abbey, and became the first crowned Queen of England. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. If you would like to watch another video, may I suggest part 1 of Mary's life, where she is the Princess Mary? Or what about my video on Mary's parents, King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon? Or how about her predecessors of the throne, Lady Jane Grey or her half-brother, King Edward VI? Next time we'll be exploring Mary's life as Queen Mary I. But until then, have a wonderful day.